The door splinters under the first kick. I have a floor lamp and a bookshelf. No time to think. If they get that data, my life isn't just a lie, it's theirs to erase. Sarah's scream cuts through the chaos as the second guard lunges. My hands shake, but the rage is sharper. The key fob burns in my palm, proof they've been watching since the first breath I took. And the records in his pocket? They're not just about me, they're about her. The blue light of the monitor etched deep lines into Caleb's face, turning his skin into a topographic map of exhaustion. His fingers danced across the mechanical keyboard, a rhythmic clatter masking the frantic thumping in his chest. A bead of sweat traced a path down his temple, stinging his eye. But he didn't blink. The Behavioral Science Foundation's digital fortress flickered on the screen. A complex web of hidden gates and virtual walls designed to keep out the world. Sarah hovered by the door, her silhouette trembling against the hallway light. The metallic scent of burnt coffee and stale air filled the cramped Columbus apartment. She gripped the deadbolt, her knuckles white. "Caleb, the patrol cars. They've passed twice now," she whispered, her voice cracking like dry parchment. He didn't answer. He watched the progress bar crawl forward. Static hissed from a nearby radio, filling the silence between her sharp inhales. He bypassed the third security gate, his pulse echoing the cursor's steady blink. The air felt heavy, charged with the ozone smell of overtaxed hardware. He wasn't just looking for money or credit scores. He was hunting for his own ghost. The Foundation had been the silent architect of his life, and today, he was breaking into the blueprints. "They're going to trace this," Sarah hissed, her eyes darting toward the window. Caleb's jaw tightened. He ignored the tremor in his hands and struck the final key. The screen bled deep crimson before dissolving into a waterfall of classified directories. Personnel files, psychological profiles, and hidden funding streams cascaded downward. He leaned in, the hum of the cooling fan vibrating through his desk. The data sat raw and exposed. He reached for a thumb drive, the plastic cool and smooth against his palm, and plugged it into the slot. The breach was complete. For the first time in 24 years, Caleb felt the weight of a secret that belonged only to him. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the frantic click rub of Caleb's thumb against the smooth riverstone in his pocket. He stared at the screen, watching the files transfer. He felt like a thief in his own history. Sarah's breathing was a jagged rhythm behind him. She moved toward the window, peeling back the edge of a heavy curtain. The streetlights outside cast long, skeletal shadows across the floor. "We need to go, Caleb. Now," she urged, her voice a low vibration of terror. "Just a few more seconds," he muttered. The progress bar was at 98%. His eyes scanned the file names. Project Echo, Developmental Node B, Subject 402. He didn't know which one was him, but he knew the Foundation didn't keep records for people they didn't intend to own. The transfer finished with a soft chime that sounded like a gunshot in the quiet room. Caleb yanked the drive out, the metal tip still warm from the data flow. He stood up, his legs stiff from hours of crouching over the machine. The apartment felt different now. No longer a sanctuary, but a cage that had been identified. He looked at the stacks of hardware, the cooling fans still whirring, and felt a sudden, sharp pang of loss. He was leaving behind the only life he remembered for a truth he wasn't sure he could survive. A sudden, heavy thud vibrated through the floorboards. It wasn't the wind or a neighbor's heavy footstep. It was the unmistakable sound of a shoulder hitting a door, the front door of the building. Sarah gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "They're here." Caleb didn't hesitate. He grabbed his jacket, the river stone heavy in his pocket, and lunged for the kitchen. "The back way! Move!" But before they could reach the hallway, the apartment door didn't just open. It exploded inward. The wood splintered with a sickening crack, the sound of a heavy boot meeting the frame. Two men in dark tactical jackets surged into the room. They weren't police. They moved with a silent, predatory grace that suggested private money and high-end training. The first man, a wall of muscle with a jagged scar across his chin, lunged for Caleb. Caleb didn't think. He reacted with a desperation he didn't know he possessed. He grabbed the heavy floor lamp beside the desk, the brass pole cold in his grip, and swung it with a guttural roar. The lamp connected with the man's ribs with a dull thwack, sending him stumbling back into a stack of server racks. The smell of ozone and sparks filled the air as the equipment shattered. "Get out!" Caleb screamed at Sarah. The second intruder reached for her, his gloved hand closing around her arm. Sarah didn't wait for Caleb to save her. She grabbed the edge of the heavy oak bookshelf, the one Caleb had filled with old technical manuals, and threw her entire weight against it. The shelf groaned and then tipped, a landslide of paper and wood crashing down onto the man's legs. He went down with a sharp cry of pain, pinned under the weight of 100 dead books. Caleb scrambled toward the first man, who was already pushing himself up from the wreckage of the servers. As the man lunged again, his jacket pulled back, revealing a high-encryption key fob clipped to his belt. It was a sleek, silver device that pulsed with a steady blue light. Caleb knew that light. It was the master key for the Foundation's physical archives. In the chaos of the struggle, Caleb didn't go for a punch. He reached out, his fingers sliding under the man's belt, and yanked. The clip snapped. He had it. "Caleb, the window!" Sarah yelled. The man with the scar lunged, his fingers grazing Caleb's throat. But Caleb ducked, the metallic scent of the man's sweat filling his nose. He shoved the intruder hard into the wall and bolted for the fire escape. He and Sarah scrambled through the window, the cold night air hitting them like a physical blow. The rusted metal slats of the fire escape groaned under their weight, the sound of their boots ringing out in the narrow alleyway. They descended in a blur of motion, the smell of wet iron and old grease clinging to their clothes. Caleb's heart was a frantic bird against his ribs. They reached the ground and sprinted into the labyrinth of the Columbus back streets, the shadows swallowing them whole. They didn't stop until they reached a narrow, trash-strewn alley 3 blocks away. Caleb leaned against a brick wall, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He pulled the stolen key fob from his pocket, the blue light blinking in the darkness. Next to it, he pulled out a crumpled folder he had snatched from the intruder's jacket during the fight. "What is that?" Sarah whispered, her curls wild and her eyes wide with shock. Caleb opened the folder. His hands began to shake, a fine tremor that he couldn't control. Inside were childhood medical records. There were photos of him at age 5, age 10, age 15. But it wasn't the photos that made the world tilt. It was the letterhead. Subverted Phase 1. Smart decision. Caleb felt a surge of grim confidence. He had spent years wondering why his parents, Martha and Thomas, were so obsessed with his routine, his heart rate, his every emotional flicker. Now, he had the evidence. He would find proof that they were being paid to watch him, perhaps by some government agency or a rival tech firm. He would use this folder to confront them, to break their hold over him. He imagined the look on Martha's face when he presented her with the proof of her employment. He was the investigator now. He was the one with the data. He felt a sense of power he had never known. Phase 2. False positive. He flipped to the back of the folder, searching for the payroll logs. His eyes scanned the names of the board of directors for the Behavioral Science Foundation. He found the list, printed in a clean, professional font. He expected to see some anonymous corporate names, some faceless billionaires. He felt a wave of relief as he saw the name Miller at the top of the list. There it is, he thought. They're just employees. They're just middle management. He could handle that. He could outrun a paycheck. He looked at Sarah and gave a small, triumphant nod. "I've got them," he whispered. "I know who's paying the bills." Phase 3. The crack. He turned the page to see the signatures. He expected to see Martha Miller's name as a primary observer or a guardian liaison. But as his eyes traced the ink, his brow furrowed. The title wasn't Observer. He looked closer at the organization chart. Martha's name wasn't at the bottom or even in the middle. It was at the very top, circled in red ink. And the date on her appointment wasn't from when they moved to Columbus. It was from 3 years before he was born. Phase 4. Catastrophic reveal. The world seemed to lose its color. Caleb's knees buckled, and he slid down the brick wall, the folder fluttering in his lap. Martha wasn't a victim of the foundation. She wasn't a hired hand. She was the architect. She was a high-ranking board member, the director of longitudinal studies. Every "I love you" before bed, every bandage on a scraped knee, every birthday cake had been a directive she had approved for herself. His entire childhood wasn't just monitored. It was a production she had directed. The realization hit him like a physical blow to the stomach. He hadn't just been watched by the foundation. He had been raised by the foundation. His mother wasn't his mother. She was his lead researcher. He looked at the medical records again and saw the notes in her handwriting. Subject shows increased cortisol levels. Recommend adjusting environmental stressors. "Caleb, what is it?" Sarah knelt beside him, her hand on his shoulder. He couldn't speak. He just pointed at the signature. The betrayal was so absolute, it felt like his own skin was a lie. By hacking the foundation, he hadn't just found the enemy. He had alerted them that their prize specimen was finally awake. He wasn't a man escaping a conspiracy. He was a lab rat who had just bit the scientist's finger, and the scientist was the woman who had tucked him in at night. "We have to go," he finally choked out, the click rub of the stone in his pocket reaching a frantic pace. "They aren't just looking for the data, Sarah. They're looking for their property." The neon sign of the Sleepwell Motel flickered with a rhythmic buzz, casting a sickly green light over the cracked pavement. Caleb stood at the edge of the lot, his hood pulled low. The air smelled of rain and old grease from a nearby diner. He felt the weight of the world pressing down on him. His phone was a dead piece of plastic in his pocket. He had seen the notification before he smashed it. His bank accounts were gone, wiped clean, replaced by a balance of 0 and a contact financial institution alert. Even worse, he had seen his own face on a gas station TV. Not as a missing person, but as a fugitive. A felony warrant for aggravated assault and data theft. "They're fast," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the motel's air conditioning units. She looked exhausted, her curls matted with sweat and grime. "They're the foundation," Caleb replied, his voice flat. "They don't just follow the law, they write the scripts for it." He checked into the motel using a fake ID he'd made months ago as a precaution. The clerk didn't even look up from his crossword puzzle. Room 114 was a tomb of floral wallpaper and the suffocating scent of industrial bleach. The carpet felt tacky under his boots, and the sanitized for your protection band on the toilet felt like a cruel joke. Sarah collapsed onto one of the twin beds, her eyes closing almost instantly. Caleb couldn't sleep. He sat by the window, peering through a crack in the heavy curtains. Every car that passed was a potential threat. Every shadow was a contractor. Then he saw it. A black SUV, windows tinted to a mirror finish, pulled into the lot across the street. It didn't park. It just sat there, the engine idling with a low, predatory rumble. It was too clean for this neighborhood, too deliberate. Caleb turned away from the window, his heart hammering. He needed to think. He needed a way out. He reached under his pillow, a nervous habit checking for the small knife he'd stashed there. His fingers hit something else, something paper. He pulled it out. It was a small, spiral-bound notebook. He opened it, and his breath hitched. The pages were filled with a neat, clinical script. October 14th. Subject B shows increased heart rate during REM sleep. Possible onset of Phase 4 awareness. October 15th. Subject B interacted with female associate, Sarah. Emotional variance noted. Recommend continued observation. Asterisk. The Subject B observation log. It hadn't been there when they checked in. Someone had been in the room while they were in the bathroom or while Sarah was sleeping. The Foundation wasn't just following them. They were already inside the room. Caleb lunged for Sarah, shaking her awake. "We have to move, now." What? What is it?" she stammered, blinking away sleep. "The room is compromised. They're here." They scrambled out the back door, avoiding the main lobby. Caleb led her to their car, a beat-up sedan they'd parked in the shadows. He hopped into the driver's seat and turned the key. The engine roared to life, but as he shifted into reverse and tapped the brake, the pedal went straight to the floor. There was no resistance, no pressure. "The brakes!" Caleb hissed, his eyes wide. They cut the lines. He looked up. The black SUV was moving now, slowly turning into the motel lot. They were trapped in a metal box with no way to stop. "Out! Get out!" Caleb shoved Sarah toward the passenger door. They tumbled onto the asphalt just as the SUV accelerated. They sprinted toward the back of the lot, toward a secluded area filled with rows of dead vehicles, a makeshift graveyard for cars that had long since given up. The mercury vapor lights overhead flickered, plunging the lot into darkness every 4 seconds. The orange glow would hum back to life, resetting Caleb's eyes, making the world jump like a broken film strip. There. Caleb pointed to a relatively new-looking truck near the back fence. "If I can jump the ignition," he reached the truck and shattered the driver's side window with a heavy rock. The sound of breaking glass was a gunshot in the quiet lot. He scrambled inside, his fingers searching for the wires beneath the steering column. "Caleb, hurry!" Sarah was watching the entrance, her body shaking. Suddenly, a shadow detached itself from the side of a rusted van. A man stepped into the flickering orange light. He wasn't a tactical contractor. He was a local thug, his face a mess of old scars and his hands covered in grease. He held a heavy iron bar, the metal glinting in the mercury glow. "Foundation says you're worth a lot of money, kid," the man growled, his voice like grinding stones. He lunged. Caleb barely had time to throw himself out of the truck. The iron bar slammed into the door frame with a bone-jarring clang. The struggle was primal. They rolled in the mud and oil of the lot, the smell of old gasoline and rot filling Caleb's nostrils. The man was stronger, but Caleb was faster. He felt a strange, cold clarity wash over him. His movements weren't frantic, they were precise. He saw the man's openings before they happened. The thug swung again, but Caleb ducked, his hand finding a heavy tire iron lying in the dirt. He swung it with a sickening force. The metal connected with the man's knee, a wet crunch echoing through the lot. The man screamed and fell, but Caleb didn't stop. He lunged forward, the tire iron raised high, his eyes fixed on the man's temple. "Caleb, stop!" Sarah's voice pierced through the cold fog in his mind. Caleb froze. The tire iron was inches from the man's head. He looked down at the thug, who was whimpering in the mud, his leg twisted at an impossible angle. Caleb looked at his own hands. They were steady. He felt no remorse, no horror. Only a cold, efficient satisfaction. The ease of it, the lethal instinct that had just taken over, terrified him more than the foundation ever could. He dropped the tire iron, the metal clattering against the pavement. I didn't even think," he whispered, his voice trembling. "We have to go," Sarah said, her voice full of a new kind of fear. They managed to find another car, an old sedan with the keys left in the visor, and sped away from the lot, the flickering lights of the graveyard fading in the rearview mirror. They drove for hours, the silence in the car heavy and suffocating. Caleb kept his hands firmly on the wheel, terrified of what they were capable of. Finally, they pulled into a rest stop, the air smelling of pine and damp earth. Caleb pulled out the stolen key fob and his laptop. His fingers moved with a mechanical precision as he began to decode the files he'd taken from the apartment. He needed to know what he was. A video file appeared on the screen. It was grainy, dated 15 years ago. It showed a younger Thomas Miller, his face etched with a rare, raw emotion. He was standing in a sterile office, shouting at someone off camera. "It's enough, Martha. He's a child, not a data point. I won't do it anymore." Martha's voice came from off camera, cold and level. "You'll do exactly what the Foundation requires, Thomas. Unless you want the authorities to see the files from your time in the service. The accident in the desert? It would be a shame if that came to light." Thomas slumped into a chair, his head in his hands. He looked broken. "This is for the greater good," Martha's voice continued. "We are shaping the future. Caleb is the key." Caleb closed the laptop. The click rub of the stone in his pocket was the only sound in the car. His father wasn't a monster. He was a prisoner, a man who had been blackmailed into playing a role for 2 decades. "They're having a gala," Caleb said, his voice a low growl. "A Thanksgiving celebration at the estate. All the board members will be there." "Caleb, no," Sarah said, sensing his intent. "It's the only way. The master files are in the basement. If I can get them, I can end this. I can free him. I can free us." He looked at Sarah, and for the first time, he saw the exhaustion in her eyes. He saw the toll his mystery had taken on her. He realized he was asking her to follow him into the heart of the beast. "I have to do this alone," he said. "Like hell you do," she replied, but her voice lacked its usual conviction. The plan was set. They would head to the Miller estate, a fortress of glass and stone nestled in the hills. It was time for the lab rat to return to the maze. The Miller estate was a monument to clinical perfection. Even in the dark, the white marble of the driveway seemed to glow, and the manicured lawns looked like they had been trimmed with a scalpel. The sound of a string quartet drifted from the open windows of the ballroom, a sophisticated mask for the cold machinery hidden beneath the floorboards. Caleb moved through the shadows of the peripheral gardens, his heart a steady, heavy drum. He had left Sarah at a safe distance, a decision that felt like tearing off a limb. He had seen the police scanners. She had been flagged. The Foundation knew she was his weakness. He found the entrance to the service tunnels near the greenhouse. The air inside was cool and smelled of damp concrete and expensive fertilizer. He moved with a ghost-like silence, his boots barely making a sound on the reinforced floor. He knew the layout. He had spent 20 years memorizing every corner of this cage. He reached the heavy steel door of the basement. He pulled out the stolen key fob. The blue light pulsed, and with a soft click, the lock disengaged. The basement was a world away from the elegance above. It was a high-tech bunker, filled with the hum of server racks and the blinking of 1,000 LED lights. In the center of the room stood a large mahogany filing cabinet, a strange analog relic in a digital world. Caleb lunged for it. He pulled out the drawer labeled Subject B. Inside were hundreds of folders. He grabbed the one on top and opened it. Subverted. Phase 1. Smart decision. Caleb felt a surge of triumph. This was it. The absolute proof he needed. He expected to find adoption papers, perhaps with a forged signature or a hidden clause. He would find the name of his biological parents, the people the Foundation had stolen him from. He would use this to reclaim his legal identity, to sue the Foundation into oblivion, and to finally have a name that wasn't a designation. He felt like he was finally holding the key to his own prison cell. He would show the world that he was a stolen child, a victim of a grand kidnapping. Phase 2. False positive. He flipped through the first few pages. He saw a birth certificate. It looked official, with a gold seal and a hospital crest. He saw the name Caleb and the date of his birth. He felt a wave of relief wash over him. It was real. He wasn't a ghost. He looked at the section for parents and saw the names were blank, but there was a reference to a genetic donor file. This was the smoking gun. He just needed to find that file, and he would have a family. He smiled, a genuine, shaky smile. He was almost home. Phase 3. The crack. He turned to the next section, titled Acquisition Logistics. He expected to see a price tag, a contract with an orphanage, or a record of a state-sponsored placement. But the page was empty except for a single typed sentence. Subject B, generated via in vitro synthesis using donor 77 and node 4. He frowned, his mind racing to find a metaphor that made sense. Generated. He looked at the medical history again. There were no records of a birth, no hospital name, just a series of initialization logs. Phase 4. Catastrophic reveal. The file didn't describe a kidnapping. It described a manufacture. Caleb wasn't a stolen child. He was a custom-built asset. There were no biological parents to find because he had been assembled in a lab. His genetic code, a best-of reel of the Foundation's most desired traits. The parents he had been looking for were a series of test tubes and a team of geneticists. He realized with a sickening jolt that he had no legal existence. He wasn't a citizen or a person in any way the law understood. He was a proprietary biological product. The Foundation didn't just own his childhood, they owned his very DNA. He was a patent, not a person. If he went to the police, what would he tell them? That he was a piece of stolen equipment? The folders in his hand weren't a record of his life. They were a maintenance manual. The weight of the revelation made the air in the basement feel thin, like he was standing on the moon. He had spent his whole life trying to find the real him, only to find out that the real him was a corporate project. I told you not to come here, Caleb. The voice was sharp and dry. Caleb whirled around. Thomas Miller stood in the doorway, his back as straight as a spear. He wasn't wearing his gala tuxedo. He was in his old military fatigues, the fabric worn and smelling of cedar. "You're not my father," Caleb spat, the words tasting like ash. Thomas didn't flinch. "I am the man who kept you alive for 20 years. That has to count for something." "It counts for a lie." Caleb lunged forward, his rage finally breaking the surface. He expected Thomas to fold, to be the broken man he had seen in the video. But Thomas moved with a sudden, terrifying fluidity. He caught Caleb's wrist, twisted, and sent him slamming into the side of a server rack. The impact knocked the wind out of Caleb's lungs, the smell of ozone and dust filling his nose. Thomas didn't stop. He moved in, his movements a blur of practiced military efficiency. He pinned Caleb against the cold metal, his forearm pressing into Caleb's throat. "You were always too curious," Thomas whispered, his voice cracking. "I tried to protect you from the truth, but you just kept digging." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, sleek device, a syringe filled with a clear, shimmering liquid. "This will help," Thomas said, his eyes filled with a desperate, twisted kind of love. "It's a reset. You won't remember the basement. You won't remember the folder. We can go back to how it was. We can be a family again." "No!" Caleb thrashed, his boots scraping against the concrete floor. The needle gleamed in the dim light of the basement. Thomas moved it toward Caleb's neck, his hand steady. Caleb felt the cold tip of the needle graze his skin. With a surge of adrenaline, Caleb reached out and grabbed a heavy glass jar from a nearby shelf, a sample container filled with some kind of preserved organic matter. He swung it with everything he had. The jar shattered against the side of Thomas's head. Glass sprayed across the floor, and a pungent chemical smell filled the air. Thomas groaned and stumbled back, the syringe falling from his hand and shattering on the concrete. Caleb didn't wait. He shoved Thomas hard, sending him sprawling into the wreckage of the glass. He stood over his father, his chest heaving, his hands covered in a mixture of blood and preservative fluid. "The family is dead, Thomas," Caleb said, his voice cold and hollow. "Caleb, please." Thomas reached out, his hand shaking. A sharp, rhythmic clicking sound echoed through the room, the sound of heels on concrete. Martha Miller stepped into the light. She looked immaculate, her silk dress shimmering, her hair perfectly in place. She looked at the scene, the broken glass, her bleeding husband, her son standing in the wreckage. And her expression didn't change. She looked like she was reviewing a disappointing lab report. "Well," she said, her voice a calm, clinical bell. "It seems we've reached the end of the observation period." Caleb turned to her, the tire iron from the car lot suddenly feeling heavy in his hand. "You're a monster." Martha sighed, a sound of genuine weariness. "I'm a scientist, Caleb, and you are my greatest achievement. But I think it's time you knew the full extent of your heritage." She walked toward a computer terminal and tapped a few keys. An image appeared on the large wall monitor. It was a man, dark-haired and sharp-featured, with eyes that looked like chips of frozen flint. "Arthur Vance was a distraction," Martha said. "A paid actor we used to see if we could trigger a specific trauma response. He was the interstate butcher because we needed you to fear the darkness inside yourself." She pointed to the man on the screen. "This is your biological donor. He was the most effective shadow operative the government ever produced. A man who could dismantle a regime with a piano wire and a smile. He died 10 years ago. But his instincts, they live on in you." Caleb looked at the man on the screen. He saw the same set of the jaw, the same cold clarity in the eyes. "We didn't just want a soldier, Caleb. We wanted a masterpiece. A man with the skills of an assassin and the psychological profile of a loyal son. But it seems the nature side of the equation is winning. She looked at him, a predatory glint in her eyes. The authorities are already on their way. I've leaked your location. I want to see what you do when the world comes for you. Will you be the son we raised, or the monster we built? The sirens began in the distance, a low, mournful wail that grew louder with every second. The red and blue lights began to dance against the high windows of the estate. Caleb stood in the center of the basement, the weight of his heritage pressing down on him. He looked at Martha, then at the bleeding Thomas, then at the image of the assassin on the screen. He felt the riverstone in his pocket. He rubbed it, the click rub a steady rhythm in the chaos. "I'm neither," he said, his voice surprisingly calm. He turned to the main server rack. He didn't go for the data this time. He went for the power. He found the main transformer, a heavy, humming box that fed the entire estate's security grid. He pulled a small, modified device from his pocket, something he'd built in the motel room. He jammed it into the cooling vents. A shower of sparks erupted. The hum of the servers rose to a shriek, and then, with a deafening pop, the lights died. The basement was plunged into a thick, absolute darkness. The only light came from the flickering red failure LEDs on the server racks. In the confusion, Caleb moved. He didn't head for the tunnels. He headed for the garbage chute, a wide, stainless steel slide that led to the industrial bins at the back of the property. He slid into the dark, the cold metal biting into his palms, the smell of stale air and waste filling his lungs. He hit the bottom with a heavy thud, the plastic of the bin cushioning his fall. He scrambled out, staying low, moving through the shadows of the estate's perimeter. The police were everywhere, their flashlights cutting through the dark like searchlights. But they were looking for a man running, not a ghost moving through the trees. He reached the main road and didn't stop. He ran until his lungs burned, until the lights of the Miller estate were just a faint glow in the distance. 2 weeks later, the wind off Lake Michigan was a biting, relentless force. It whipped through the trees of the Chicago park, numbing Caleb's face and making it difficult to breathe. The air smelled of freshly cut grass, a sweet, artificial scent that felt wrong in the freezing cold. Caleb sat on a lone bench, his coat huddled around him. He looked at the skyline, the towers of glass and steel reaching for the gray sky. He felt invisible. A figure approached from the path. Sarah. She looked older, her face etched with a weariness that hadn't been there before. She sat down next to him, her shoulder brushing his. "It's over," she said, her voice a low vibration in the wind. "Is it?" Caleb asked. "The news. It's everywhere. The Subject B files. The foundation is being dismantled. Martha and Thomas are under federal investigation. The whole recruitment program. It's gone." Caleb nodded. He had spent 48 hours in a remote internet cafe, using the Foundation's own emergency broadcast frequency to bypass every filter and firewall. He had sent the truth to every major news outlet in the country. He had watched the upload progress bar, his heart a steady beat, knowing that with every percent, his old life was being deleted. "What now?" Sarah asked, looking at him. Caleb reached into his pocket and pulled out the riverstone. He looked at it for a long time, then he stood up and walked to the edge of the lake. He threw the stone as far as he could. It vanished into the dark, churning water without a sound. "I don't know," he said, turning back to her. "But for the first time, I'm the one who gets to decide." He watched a group of children playing on a nearby swing set. One of the swings moved back and forth at a high speed, though there was no child on it and no wind strong enough to move it. It was a strange, unsettling sight. But Caleb didn't look away. He realized that his past was a script written by monsters, but his future was a blank page. He reached out and took Sarah's hand. Her skin was warm, real, and for the first time in his life, Caleb Miller didn't need to check the stitching. He was finally, undeniably, awake.